There are few things more American than a simple breakfast you barely think about, the kind that shows up on the table day after day and quietly becomes part of what feels steady and dependable in life. That's why it's such a strange doorway into this story, because behind a symbol that looks harmless, even wholesome, sits something many people recognize once they've lived long enough. The way credit can drift toward the person with the right title, the right voice, the right place in the room, while the person who actually carried the work stays in the background, useful and uncelebrated. This is a true story about that kind of imbalance, the kind that doesn't start with shouting or dramatic betrayal, but with small, almost polite decisions that seem reasonable in the moment and become permanent before anyone admits what's happening. It's about merit that isn't rewarded the way we're taught it should be, about hierarchies that form quietly and then harden, and about how recognition is often less about what you did than about who people were prepared to see. The part that stays with you, especially when you've watched families and workplaces repeat the same pattern for decades, is how early these roles get assigned and how quickly everyone learns to live inside them. This happened to real people, inside a family where loyalty and duty were treated like obligations, and where the story of who mattered was shaped long before the outside world ever noticed the result. And once that uneven order settled in, it wasn't questioned, it was normalized, and it began steering every choice that followed as if there had never been another way it could have turned out. What you just heard happened within a real family, and its consequences would eventually touch millions of people who never knew their names. This is the story of the Kellogg brothers, of Will Keith Kellogg, the quieter, practical one, whose work would help create something familiar enough to disappear into daily routine, and of his older brother, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, a commanding presence, confident in his authority and convinced of his role as guardian of both ideas and institutions. Their lives became entangled at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, a place built on order, discipline, and certainty, where health, morality, and control were closely linked. It was there that a simple food, later known to the world as cornflakes, began to take shape. If stories like this matter to you, the kind that look ordinary on the surface but carry quieter human costs underneath, taking a moment to like the video helps keep these stories alive. Because long before it reached breakfast tables, long before names became brands, the imbalance you sensed had already found a home between two brothers who learned very early that they were not meant to stand in the same place. They came from the same home, surrounded by the same rules and expectations, but they learned very different lessons about where they stood. One brother was encouraged to speak, to explain, to decide. When he entered a room, conversations adjusted to him, and plans quietly waited for his approval before moving forward. The other learned to listen first. He became the one who stayed a little longer to finish a task, who stepped in when something practical needed attention, who made sure things worked without ever asking whether his effort would be noticed. At family gatherings, one voice naturally carried across the table, shaping opinions and setting direction, while the other nodded, agreed, and filled in the gaps that made those decisions possible. None of this felt harsh at the time. It felt efficient, even sensible. Someone had to lead, someone had to support, and everyone involved learned to see that balance as reasonable. Over the years, small habits reinforced it. Praise followed confidence more than contribution. Responsibility grew without recognition. Usefulness became a quiet expectation rather than something to be acknowledged. I have seen this kind of arrangement many times, where the person who keeps things running becomes almost invisible, precisely because nothing ever falls apart. The uncomfortable truth is that no one needed to act unfairly for the imbalance to deepen. It simply settled into place, rationalized by familiarity and repetition. What matters is that this pattern did not stay confined to the family. It was already shaping how each brother would be seen, heard, and valued once their lives moved beyond the house and into a setting where that same hierarchy would no longer be personal, but embedded in the very structure they were about to enter. The place where that family dynamic followed them was not just a workplace, but a world with its own rhythms and rules, where days were structured, schedules were respected, and authority was visible in small, repeated ways. There were set hours, planned demonstrations, and visitors who arrived expecting guidance, reassurance, and certainty. In that setting, one brother moved easily. He addressed groups, explained principles, and stood at the front when ideas were presented, comfortable with being watched and remembered. The other followed a different routine. He arrived early, stayed close to the machinery and the processes, made sure things were prepared before anyone noticed they needed to be. When guests were ushered through clean corridors and orderly rooms, they saw calm and competence, but they rarely asked who had made that possible. Over time, this division settled into habit. Talks were scheduled around one brother's presence, while the other adjusted his day to support whatever was required next. When everything functioned smoothly, it was taken as proof that the system worked. When something went wrong, he was the one quietly called in to fix it, then step back again. There was nothing theatrical about this arrangement, and no open conflict. It rewarded visibility and voice, not consistency. I have seen how easily that kind of structure convinces people that recognition and contribution are the same thing, even when they are not. Within these walls, usefulness became expected, authority became unquestioned, and a pattern formed that felt natural to everyone involved. And it was here, inside this orderly environment, that something unassuming began to take shape. Something meant to move far beyond these routines and into ordinary kitchens, where its origin would soon matter more than anyone inside these walls expected. What emerged from that environment did not arrive with ceremony or clear ownership. It came together through routine adjustments, trial, repetition, and practical problem-solving, the kind of work that rarely leaves a single signature behind. One brother spoke publicly about principles and purpose, framing what was happening in broad, confident terms that people found reassuring. The other focused on the process itself, experimenting quietly, refining methods, making sure the result was consistent enough to work day after day. When questions were asked, answers tended to come from the person already positioned as the authority. When improvements were needed, they were handled out of sight, folded back into the routine without comment. Over time, the story began to simplify itself. Visitors and observers repeated the version they heard most often, the one that came neatly packaged and confidently delivered. The quieter contribution did not disappear, it was simply absorbed, treated as part of the background rather than something worth naming. I have seen how this happens, how narratives favor clarity over accuracy, and how credit drifts toward whoever is already standing at the front of the room. There is rarely a moment when someone decides to erase another person. It happens through convenience, through repetition, through the slow comfort of a single, tidy explanation. At first, that imbalance can feel tolerable, even temporary. But eventually, there comes a point when silence no longer feels like patience, and usefulness no longer feels like partnership. What had been created inside this controlled world was about to move outward, and once it did, the question of who it belonged to would no longer stay quietly unresolved. There comes a moment in stories like this when staying becomes more damaging than leaving, even if leaving feels like a quiet kind of disloyalty. The disagreement did not arrive as an argument or a dramatic break. It surfaced in practical conversations about scale, about reach, about whether something useful should remain controlled or be allowed to travel further. One brother believed in restraint, in keeping things aligned with principles and boundaries he felt responsible for protecting. The other saw something different. He saw repetition, demand, the possibility that an idea only fulfilled its purpose if it was allowed to reach ordinary people beyond this enclosed world. It was not ambition in the loud sense, but a practical instinct, shaped by years of making things work and watching what people actually wanted. Choosing to step away was not framed as rebellion. It was framed as necessity. He did not take speeches or titles with him, only the conviction that what had been built could survive on its own. For someone who had spent a lifetime adjusting to another person's authority, that decision carried weight far beyond business. I have seen how difficult it is for people like that to finally claim space, how they do it carefully, almost apologetically, even when they know it cannot be undone. This separation changed everything, not because it created distance, but because it exposed something that had been quietly avoided for years. Success followed faster than anyone expected, and with it came attention, money, and public recognition. But instead of closing the gap between the brothers, it hardened it. What had once been an unspoken imbalance was now visible, measurable, and impossible to ignore. And the family name that once connected them was about to become the center of a conflict neither of them could control. Once success became visible, the family name stopped being a shared inheritance and turned into contested ground. What had once connected the brothers now defined their separation. The name carried reputation, authority, and trust, and suddenly it mattered who was allowed to use it and how. Arguments no longer stayed within private conversations. They moved into letters, formal complaints, and legal language that stripped the conflict of emotion while preserving every grievance. One brother saw the name as something he had earned through position and seniority, a symbol inseparable from his authority. The other saw it as inseparable from the work he had done, from the systems he built, and the future he was now carrying forward. I have watched how quickly disputes change once institutions and courts become involved, how family disagreements harden when they are translated into documents and rulings. Winning a decision on paper does not restore trust, and losing one does not erase conviction. Each step forward made retreat less likely. The conflict narrowed, reduced to ownership and rights, while everything human around it fell away. What remained was resentment, carefully contained, and a relationship that could no longer return to what it had been. Even when victories came, they arrived without relief. They confirmed separation rather than resolving it. And as the public story of success grew cleaner and simpler, the private cost of defending it grew heavier, preparing the ground for losses that would not appear in headlines or balance sheets, but would soon shape the rest of a life. By the time the conflict settled into something permanent, the consequences were no longer limited to work or reputation. They began showing up in quieter places, the ones people rarely talk about when success is discussed. Wealth accumulated, recognition followed, and the public image continued to solidify, but the private world narrowed. Relationships became strained, then distant, not because of a single rupture, but because bitterness has a way of taking up space without announcing itself. Conversations shortened, trust thinned. Family gatherings felt heavier, shaped by what could no longer be said without reopening old wounds. I have seen how success can isolate people who carry unresolved resentment, how it convinces them to keep moving forward without ever stopping to repair what was lost along the way. The strange part is that nothing appeared wrong from the outside. The work was thriving. The name was secure. There was no obvious failure to point to. Yet the cost was being paid steadily in missed closeness, in relationships that never fully recovered, in a sense that something essential had been traded away and could not be reclaimed. Even the victories carried an aftertaste, because they reminded him of what had been defended and what had been sacrificed to do so. Money could not soften that realization, and time only made it clearer. The life being built looked complete to the world, but it felt unfinished to the person living inside it. And while the conflict with his brother had hardened into distance, something else was quietly moving in the background, a gesture that came too late to change the damage already done, but would eventually reveal just how final that separation had become. Near the end, when most conflicts have already settled into memory rather than action, something surfaced that had the weight of a closing gesture. It was not public, and it was not meant to repair a legacy. It was personal, restrained, and shaped by regret rather than argument. Words were written with care, acknowledging distance, recognizing harm, and offering something that had been withheld for too long. On paper, it looked like resolution. In life, it became something else. Time intervened, as it often does, turning intention into irony. The message did not reach its destination when it still could have mattered. When it finally did, the circumstances had changed so completely that its meaning shifted. What might have opened a conversation became a quiet object instead, carrying weight but no longer able to move anything forward. I have seen how this happens, how people wait for the right moment to speak, believing there will always be another chance, only to discover that timing is part of what gives words their power. Without it, even honesty arrives muted. This was not a dramatic reversal and not an accusation. It was simply the recognition that reconciliation, once delayed long enough, becomes symbolic rather than real. The distance between the brothers was no longer something that could be crossed, only acknowledged. What remained was not closure, but a sharper understanding of how final certain choices can be. And with that realization came a quieter question, one that does not resolve itself easily, about what truly survives when people are gone and only the story is left to speak for them. In the end, what remained was a legacy that looked clean from a distance and complicated up close. The name endured, attached to a product that became part of daily life, stripped of the tension and compromise that shaped it. History prefers simple stories, and this one eventually settled into a version that was easy to repeat and easier to remember. What it left behind were the quieter truths, the cost paid in relationships, the recognition that arrived unevenly, and the sense that not every victory feels like one when you are the person living with its consequences. I have come to believe that this is how many lives are remembered, not falsely, but incompletely. Success gets recorded. Conflict fades. The human trade-offs are absorbed into silence. There is no clear villain here and no perfect hero. Only people shaped by their roles, their timing, and the choices they made when other options still felt possible. One brother became history. The other carried the weight of what that history did not include. What makes this story linger is not the outcome, but the question it leaves behind about how many similar lives have unfolded the same way, rewarded publicly and diminished privately, without anyone noticing until it was far too late to matter. If stories like this resonate with you, the kind that stay with you not because they resolve cleanly, but because they feel familiar, then continuing to listen is often the only way to honor the parts of history that rarely speak for themselves.